right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I know folks are going to be coming in, but we'll start right at 7:30. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. This is great. My name's Chris McHugh Potts, almost 30-year resident of Medfield who loves the town. Probably one of the few people that didn't actually move to town for the schools, but moved to town because of the beautiful open space and the environmental aspects of how beautiful our town is. I'll never forget driving down Route 27 and straddling the Charles River and just being blown away by how beautiful it is. So I am really happy to be able to introduce our guest here today, Andrew Stone. He's the Executive Director of the American Groundwater Trust in Concord, New Hampshire, a nonprofit organization that works across North America. He has 40 years of experience as a professor, groundwater consultant, advocate, and educator. American Groundwater Trust's mission is to increase awareness about water resource issues, particularly those that involve groundwater across North America. Andrew is not here to take any kind of position on the school project, so we will keep him far away from that topic. But what he has graciously agreed to do tonight, just walk us through. We'll do a bit of a basic Q&A interview format, so he can help to educate us in Medfield about just some water basics. We have a lot of different water issues that are going on in town right now with a water treatment plant proposal coming up, new stormwater bylaw regulations, a climate change goal. And we just have, I think, a lot of people in town who don't understand the fundamentals of water. So we'll just kind of start off with the Q&A and we'll get going and try and keep things relatively simple. And Andrew has done this a million times. So we're just so grateful for you to be here. Thank you, Andrew. So Andrew, the first question was, in a town like Medfield that is 100% dependent on its water supply from wells, really, why should its residents care about water?
Well, I can think of several reasons why people might care about their water supply. One is it reliable, dependable, and sustainable? Is the quality okay? What does it cost? And to a certain extent, what ownership do they have sort of psychologically in that supply of water? Given that it's supplied through a utility, a water treatment system, it's a regulated utility. I don't think they have any need to be too concerned about safety because there are strict requirements on the quality controls of municipal water. But, however, there are many other reasons to be concerned about your water supply because it's a natural resource and it falls into that orbit of all the other natural resources that the community may have. So I do think that a focus on water supply issues and an awareness of where the resource is coming from is important in order to give comfort to sustainability, water quality, and ultimately to cost.
Thank you.
Does that kind of make sense?
I think so, definitely. You know, Medfield is located between both the Charles River and the Neponset River watersheds. And there are watersheds all over the country. What role do these watersheds play? What's the significance of a watershed?
All right, well, we've only got a few minutes. We need a semester. If I digress just a fraction, in the rest of the English-speaking world, a watershed is the boundary between two drainage basins or catchments. In the US, the watershed is often used to describe the area that is surrounded by what the Europeans would call a watershed. But that's the semantics. What role do they play? Well, watersheds have a focus on surface water. That's what you can see. That's the environment that most people are very familiar with when it comes to water. So given that groundwater and surface water are connected, they're not separate systems. In fact, just about every bit of water that flows down your rivers is probably coming from groundwater much of the time. In fact, nearly 40% of all the water in the US in rivers actually starts its life as groundwater, and that includes the Mississippi. So we must right off the bat understand that groundwater and surface water are connected. The watershed is a very good definable understandable area from which the water supplies may be obtained. Most people can understand that the water flows to the sea, and a watershed is defined by a particular measuring point upstream. Where is all the water coming from that is in that stream? But if you look at the word watershed, it comes from an old German word meaning divide, and that is perhaps the real meaning of watershed. It's the place where two raindrops landing next to each other, one will flow to one river and one will flow to another. It's the divide between where the water flows, left or right. And in your case, you have two major watersheds, one pretty much on the east, and then the other is the Charles River watershed, which I think most of your town contributes to.
Mm-hmm.
So the significance of watersheds is that they are hydrologically available, discernible to the public. The groundwater is the hidden part of the equation that is much more difficult to explain, but it does make good sense from a public communications point of view to consider water resources within a watershed context, even though the groundwater that is flowing beneath the watershed area may not have the same boundaries as the physical surface watershed itself. Does that help? Maybe it does.
It does, definitely. And John Thompson, if you feel that there's a point where you want to ask a sort of a clarifying question that you think would help, definitely chime in, okay?
Yeah, or put me right if I'm going wrong.
You won't. What is the difference between a watershed and an aquifer?
Well, I've just explained a watershed, I think, in terms of the surface water. Aquifer, strictly by definition, is saturated rock formations containing water. And this usually has the rider that insufficient quantities to be useful. What the public needs to understand is that aquifers do not occur like layer cakes in elementary science books or in the public's imagination. In fact, in your town area, you're sitting on top of 600 million year old rocks that are cracked and fractured and have complex mineralogical assemblies. And lying above those are a whole bunch of glacial sediments, clays, sands, gravels. And the aquifer systems that you have, some of the wells will be bedrock wells, but many of the bedrock wells in the Northeast in general, whilst the well is in bedrock, the water that the well is actually pumping out is probably stored in overlying clays and sands and gravels. So aquifers can be bedrock, they can be sands and gravels. They're usually a mixture of the two, and they're described as the rock units beneath the surface which contain water in quantities that are usable. So that's the major difference between the two.
And then what about the water table? And how does the water table play into this?
Well, that's an often misunderstood term. Technically, it's the area below which the rocks or the sediments are fully saturated. And it's a surface, if you like, the junction between the rocks that aren't saturated and the rocks that are, or the gravels and sands that are. And aquifers are recharged pretty much all from above by precipitation that trickles down through the sands, gravels, and through the rock fractures. And when you have more recharge, then you have natural flow or pumping, then the water table goes up. If the recharge goes down and your pumping continues, then the water table levels will go down. And so the level of the water table is often used as a surrogate for a kind of thermometer of how your aquifer is doing. And that's not a bad concept for the public to understand because it's relatively easy to understand. In reality, the water table is a more complex animal, and there are many places where there isn't a water table, but there's still plenty of groundwater because it's lying beneath rocks. We say it's confined. It's not a true surface between the unsaturated and the saturated. So the water table concept is very useful for people to understand.
Yeah.
If you go to San Antonio, Texas, on the news every night, they tell you the level of the water in the water table in San Antonio. It's become a part of the daily weather forecast, which is giving the public an idea of how they're doing.
Right, right. Now, how far with regard to groundwater and its and when it flows, correct? Groundwater flows underneath the ground. Yes. To a certain extent. I don't think that was something I didn't realize myself. And what's this? How far of a distance does groundwater flow?
Well, in general, there isn't a specific limit except by physics and the natural geology. Now, in your case, I think your highest point in the town is what, 200, 300 feet? It's not particularly high. And the distance by river from, again, your town to the ocean, to Boston is 50 miles, 60 miles. I'm not sure exactly what that number is. So the math there shows that it's got 50 miles to go horizontally and only 200 feet to go vertically. So the gradient, the slope, if you like, is very, very, very gentle. So the chances are that in general, the flow beneath the surface is going to be very slow because the gradient is so slow, like 1 in 1,000 or whatever, if you look at it just in those strict terms. But yes, it does flow, and it flows in lots of separate pieces. It's not one big cog flowing. The aquifer systems are a whole series of flows, and some of the surface flows will take place in the space of a few weeks or months. Some will take a few years, and some may take decades. So if you drill a well, let's say you drill it 500 feet for the sake of argument, as you go through the rock layers and intercept water, the water will be all of different ages because it's taken longer in its travels underground at various depths beneath the surface. So any water in a well anywhere is a cocktail of the water which it encounters when it's drilled. And that's one of the big things about protecting water quality by putting a lot of steel casing or in the top part of the well. So you keep out all the surface water that might be full of contaminants, and you only use the groundwater from deeper down, which is a lot older, and therefore chances are that doesn't have anywhere near as much contamination as near surface groundwater might have.
Interesting. So this is perfect segue in terms of in a typical small residential town like Medfield or so many others in the country, what are the most common water contaminants that we should all be aware of?
Well, I think the potential for contamination in a rural, suburban, urban setting is largely related to traffic and roads and runoff and storm drainage. If you're looking at citizens, and then citizens apply far more fertilizer, weed killers, and goodness knows what else per acre than farmers do. And so the suburban outflow of lawn chemicals and weedicides, that's a big risk. We need to educate the public about reading the label and only doing their kind of chemical applications at the right time. Certainly parking lots, every car has got gasoline in it, and the gasoline has got benzene and toluene and all the other nasty stuff in it that are cancer agents. So making sure that if you like, the drippings from all of the vehicles and the traffic don't get a chance to soak into the ground and become a recharge to the aquifer, that's pretty important. In winter, road salt can be a challenge. Nobody wants icy roads. We don't want accidents and car crashes. So yeah, we want our maintenance people to keep the roads safe, but there's often a trade-off between safe roads in winter and drinkable drinking water for the rest of the year. So that's just a couple of the things. And then in terms of other behaviors of the public, I don't know what percentage of your town is on septic systems, what percentage is on sewage treatment. But for people with their own on-site wastewater disposal, it's critically important that they don't put pharmaceuticals down the toilets and personal care products, and they don't dispose of anything improperly, because if it goes into a septic system, that is going to be 100% liquid recharge to the groundwater system. So common sense about lawn and garden chemicals, having the storm water system, particularly the road drainage systems, disconnected from the potential for recharge, and keeping some kind of control of road salt are important. But you must bear in mind too that some of the contaminants that get into our water supply are coming through the air. So you can't always find a bogeyman on the ground. There may be other issues that are beyond the control of citizens. But general awareness of cause and effect is the number one priority, I would say.
Can I add a little to that, Chris?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
So Andrew's correct, and Medfield has actually had issues with sodium in the water supply. Sodium, more likely than not, resulting from the application of road salt in the winter, and people using salts on their driveway. And sodium and nitrogen phosphorus from the application of fertilizer on lawns is probably in the second place biggest concern as a contaminant, because nitrogen and phosphorus, when it flows via surface water and groundwater, can end up in the small streams and ponds, and it becomes fertilizer for algal growth in the surface water. And algae, the way algae breathes is it uses these fertilizers, and also consumes oxygen. For instance, in Kingsbury Pond, when you see the pond starting to have little tiny weeds and things growing along the edges, it's because it's using all the oxygen in the pond, and it's causing, the fish, and it interrupts different aspects of the food chain in surface water. Fish and turtles and things that are living in that pond need oxygen. And so if you've ever seen, for instance, in Baker's Pond in town, when they use an oxygenator to add oxygen to it because of all the nitrogen phosphorus coming down Vinebrook. Vinebrook's in the Charles River watershed and flows through Baker's Pond and then ultimately out to the Charles River. But when these ponds and streams get choked with nitrogen phosphorus, then they're prime places for these algae to grow and consume the oxygen. Underground septic systems or private septic systems, I don't think there's a lot of them in Medfield, but what comes off of those is nitrogen, which does the same thing, and some phosphorus, which is also a contaminant to the surface water bodies. The groundwater divide in Medfield for the Neponset Charles River is that little hump that you go over just before you get to the stoplight to go into Shaw's. There's a little bump there right at Peterzini Drive. And east of that is the Neponset River watershed. West of that is the Charles River watershed. So as Andrew described, the topography controls the edge of the bathtub of the watershed. And the aquifers in Medfield are the remnants of the movement of the glacial ice over and around the bedrock surface, and particularly acting like a chisel through the fracture network of the bedrock. So it's removing rock preferentially along fractures. And as the glaciers melt, the meltwater leaves behind sand and gravel. And when you're driving down Route 109 in Medfield, you're on top of what's called an outwash plain, which is a broad, flat area, generally flat area of deep sands and gravel that fill the valley that was created by the movement of the ice. And so the aquifer is down in that sand and gravel, and Medfield's wells are located. There's three in the Charles River Valley. Wells 1 and 2 are the little brick buildings you pass when you are heading towards Millis. They're on the right-hand side of Route 109. They're the little brick house-like buildings. That's wells 1 and 2. And 3, 4, and 5 are in the Minebrook aquifer. And well 6 is along the Charles River up by the state hospital.
Yep.
And so that's where our wells are located. They're all completed, they're all finished in sand and gravel. None of them extend into bedrock. They're about 60 feet deep, but the saturated thickness of the well is about 40 to 50 feet.
So, John, thanks. That's really helpful. So, Andrew, to kind of piggyback actually on what John just said with regard to wells in particular, because I know you do so much, the American Groundwater Trust does so much work with wells. So when you have a well protection district or a well protection zone, what is that? What role does that district play?
I'm not quite sure how you're defining district there, but under safe drinking water rules from the feds, the state has authority to regulate drinking water, and the state of Massachusetts has a source water protection program. I think they call it SWAP or SWAT or something to that nature. And any public supply well has to fall under certain protection guidelines. In simple terms, it's usually drawing a circle around the wellhead and saying, right, there can be no activity taking place in this zone that could injure or harm the water supply. Yep. Now, the concentric circle concept bears no relation to physics or geological reality. I know in the case of most of New England, we've got kind of a northeast southwest trend to many of our fractures and zones. That's where the valleys are oriented, and very often the groundwater might be moving to a well in a preferred direction, in sort of parallel to the subsurface topography or the subsurface structure. But however, I think that the wellhead protection zone is it's a great learning opportunity. It's a great simplified regulatory hammer, if you like, in order to provide some form of protection. In terms of the district, I don't know whether the district you're talking about has any regulatory authority within itself, within the town, or whether the authority comes from the state. But that's the basic concept, that you keep bad stuff away from a well, and you don't allow new gas stations, and you don't allow big parking lots, or if you do, then the design of those buildings and those structures has to be very carefully and meticulously engineered to ensure that there isn't going to be infiltration of potential contaminants. And if you have a sports field in that zone, then the groundskeeper should be under very, very strict instructions about what fertilizers, weedicides, or whatever it is he might put on the school's games fields or whatever sports field it may be. So it is a zone of public consciousness of cause and effect of the supply of water. And very often you'll see beside the road, it says entering wellhead protection zone. And that really is just to keep people, oh, this is where our water's coming from.
Right.
Although in effect, the whole state should be a wellhead protection zone. I mean, there is no purpose in letting up on the protection common sense that we need to put in.
Excellent.
I can add to that, Chris.
Yep. Andrew, are you okay on time?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, I just want to check.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
I'll be quick. So Massachusetts has 3 zones that they set up absent actual mapping of the watersheds. Zone 1 is a 400-foot radius around a water supply well. Zone 2, I believe, is a half-mile radius around the well. And zone 3 is beyond the half-mile radius. Medfield's zone 2, the zone is the zone of contribution to the water supply well, and Medfield zone 2s have been mapped. And so there's a 400-foot zone 1, radius zone 1 on our wells. Then there's zone 2, which is the zone of contribution to the well and falls within the watershed. And then zone 3 is everything outside of that. And so Medfield's wells do have these zones. And as Andrew mentioned, when you start chipping away within the watershed that used to be open space, trees, and some open areas, some grass, and some lakes and ponds, you start changing the dynamic. And when you start adding pavement and rooftops, you change the dynamic even more. I mean, a typical house during a rainstorm of an inch or two can have 5,000 or 6,000 gallons of water come off of it, one rooftop. And that's a tank the size of a bus.
Wow.
So when you think about how much water that is, and when you deliver that water all across the ground surface to streams directly, you're keeping that water from going into the ground. And most of our groundwater is nourished by winter snowfall. This time of year, between now and about October, most of the rainfall is running off. It's not going directly to the aquifer. We're losing it. And so the more you build on it with impervious surfaces, the more you will lose. And also in the meantime, other things are happening, like the temperature of that runoff is changing, because when rainfall falls on a blacktop parking lot, you know how hot that is in the summertime. Now you're delivering basically hot water into cold water brooks and streams.
Wow.
So the animal that would live in those brooks and streams now may not survive, because the temperature has just gone up by even a few degrees.
Wow. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
Wow. Andrew, what are what are the key water issues that you're personally concerned about? What are the top three, I would say, that you are really most worried about in our
Well,
country?
Reading some news feeds this morning, I'm worried about the lack of rainfall in Jordan, the big droughts in Taiwan. There are big issues on a global scale with regard to water. And of course, on a national scale, we have the challenge of changing patterns of weather. Some people call it climate change, but changing weather patterns is probably a less controversial way of describing it. That is having a big effect, and is going to have a big effect on recharge. It's going to have a big effect on the sustainability of our water supplies. And it's not a linear relationship. That's difficult for some people to grasp. But if you have a 10% reduction in rainfall, you could have a 40% reduction in recharge to your aquifer. It's not a direct single relationship. So even a small change in temperature, small change in the duration, intensity, or frequency of the rain can make a big difference to the sustainability of the water supplies. But if you ask me for one big issue that I'm worried about in terms of water, I just read a figure yesterday, I think it was, that the average Massachusetts family is spending $480 a year on their water supply. The average Massachusetts family is probably spending close to $2,000 per family on cell phones. We as a society, in your community as a social entity, has got to get its values right. We need to charge a lot more for the safe, dependable water supply in order to provide the funds for infrastructure and for the policing, supervision, and engineering that we need to secure safe, sustainable water. And the challenge we have is that people are not putting the right value to the resource. They're getting tons and tons, literally tons by weight of water delivered basically for free for a whole year for $484 per house, which is crazy when they're paying over $2,000, in some cases $3,000 for a family of four to have cell phone service. So, and as you just throw in cable and a few other things that we believe are absolute necessities of life. So putting an emphasis on the value of water is probably the biggest educational challenge. And in economics 101, everybody knows that if you don't understand value, then you go on price. We have to educate on the value of a resource, the value of maintaining and sustaining the resource and not putting into jeopardy the recharge of our aquifers, the pure flowing of our streams and our rivers. And that's why those contamination issues I described earlier on about lawn and garden chemicals and about parking lot design and all the rest of it are so important. We cannot afford to let up. Population's increasing. I know we've had a hiccup in our population, but prior to COVID, the US population is rising at 7,000 people a day. They've all got to live somewhere. They require water and all the things that the water provides. So the big educational challenge is to show the importance of the water supplies and the more awareness the public can have of where the water's coming from, who's in charge of it, who's managing it, the better. And I mean, I think that Massachusetts has, I don't know, nearly 4,000 municipal water supplies. They all have responsibilities. And I think the civics aspect of governance of water, who controls what, who has the authority, and a lot of it comes down to planning boards and zoning boards. In New Hampshire, where I live, the big debate is lot size. If you have 2 acres, chances are you can have your well and your septic and your geothermal, no problem at all. You start cutting it down to 1 acre or ½ acre lots, and no, you can't do it, because then the demand is going to be in excess of Mother Nature to provide. We who are supposedly scientifically conscious need to speak up and not allow those who are not scientifically conscious but politically powerful to overrule what we need to do in our societies. So there we are. Here endeth the first lesson.
No, that's great. Thank you. Oops, sorry, I got the dog in the background.
Okay, can I add something to that, Chris?
Yeah, definitely. I was hoping that you would.
I want to hammer home Andrew's point. And part of that point is that our water supply in Medfield can be mathematically calculated to its limit. And by that, I mean, there is a number of gallons certain that would support the numbers of people in our town. And so if you put your hands over your ears and eyes and pretend that that number doesn't exist, the town will ultimately become overpopulated and rely on someone else's watershed and someone else's water. And that's called the tragedy of the commons, when people only think about themselves and not that ultimately the amount of resource that they take away has to come from somebody else's resource. And it's a very slippery slope, and you don't want to go down that slope. The town should know how much population its water supply can support. The amount of water that we can serve to people is finite, and we need to know what that number is. And unfortunately, absent that, the town will become overpopulated. It will have to go on MWRA water, and the contaminants in that water are contain things like trihalomethanes that are cancer causing, things we don't want to be drinking. We want to control our water supply for the future. But unfortunately, as Andrew says, it's planning boards and zoning boards that need to know what the limits of our water supply are and stick to those limits with population. Climate change is caused by overpopulation, period. And I don't mean having less children. I mean, we're going to have to figure out a way to redistribute population on this planet, getting away from cities and concentrated areas and doing things, as Andrew says, controlling zoning. People can live on land, but they have to have 2 acres. You have to think about that because it's a very real problem. And it's the reason we're seeing these limited uses of water right now, because there's only so much water in the ground. And if you start overtaxing that, you will start to run out, and you'll have more and more of these, times when we can't water our lawns. You'll always have people that have money to pay unlimited amounts for water, but it needs to be in balance with the watershed.
Thanks, John.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I don't know if anybody in the audience has any basic, so I'm losing my voice, basic questions that you want to, if you want to just, gain a little bit more of a better understanding of the water basics. Feel free to type in a question in the Q&A if you want. If you don't, we can let Andrew have his Monday night back and express our deep gratitude for him sharing his time with us tonight. But I'll just give it a couple minutes. And as we're waiting actually for if there's any questions out there that folks want to ask Andrew, I did want to take one very special moment to recognize a resident that's with us tonight who's here. 92, I believe she said. Longtime resident and attendee Carolyn Stanley. She and her late husband Mike have been stalwart supporters and leaders within the trustees of the reservations and have protected literally hundreds of open space, not just in Medfield, but across the state. Both have served on countless town committees, including the Conservation Commission and Historical Commission. Carolyn and Mike were honestly my biggest inspirations when I moved into Medfield. And the reason that Jerry and I became involved with the trustees when we first moved in. I'm so pleased that she's here tonight. She and Mike, God bless his soul, have been just phenomenal advocates for environmental issues and open space and preserving all of it for future generations. So Carolyn, I hope you heard all of that. Are you there? You can unmute, hopefully. And I'll add too that her husband, Mike, and John Thompson will appreciate that. They've also been Mike was very interested in all the archaeological treasures in town, and he and John would walk their property and discover all kinds of wonderful buried treasures that harkened back to our ancient times in Medfield. And so there's a long history with our Stanleys in town, right, John?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So Carolyn, I hope you're there. All right, we have a couple questions in the chat, in the Q&A here. Let's see. Okay, we're just going to move on. So I think that's it. We're going to, somebody asked about the project, so we will move into that, but I'm not going to I'll separate that from Andrew, and he can, like I said, go on with his Monday night, and thank you for educating us on some very, very important basics. And I know there's much more with regard to what we need to know. So thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thank you for the
Thanks, Andrew.
opportunity. Always pleased to help if I can. So good luck with the rest of your deliberations.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.
Right, I'm going to leave the meeting now, but that's nothing personal. Don't take it personally.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks
Good
again.
night, everybody.
Okay, good night.
Right.
Okay, so so the question that came up in this chat is, can someone explain basically how all this applies to the school project, and that this person is new to the issue? So John, can you help to translate? And again, I don't expect you to take a personal position on the school, good or bad, but when people are hearing that this building is going to be built behind the Wheelock site, it's going to be built in a well protection district, it's going to be built in a, what do all the things that Andrew talked about, can you translate what that means to that particular location?
Yeah, I can provide a little bit of translation for this. And I don't have any stake in this project. My son graduated from Medfield High School in 2010. He's long out of Wheelock School, but I have fond memories of going over there. So what we need to be careful of here, and with any construction project and any development project, is how do we manage the rainwater, the water that falls on the site? How does it get from falling out of the sky to the aquifer or to the Charles River? The Wheelock site is in the Charles River Valley. What are the things we need to think about? Well, water falling on the roof, water falling on solar panels, water falling on pavement. How do we manage that water? How do we get it into the ground rather than allowing it to run off where we lose it and it's no longer available to the aquifer? And also that water can pick up contaminants. And as Andrew mentioned, if you're constantly putting nitrogen, phosphorus fertilizer on a soccer field, if you're not very careful about the application of those fertilizers, some of that is leaching into your groundwater below. It's going into the aquifer and it's traveling to the well, because the well is like a straw. It's like a straw sucking water out of a glass. And so you have to very carefully manage these things in the process of design. And when I was on the Conservation Commission with Caroline, we used to ask for developers in town to say use cisterns from the runoff from the roof, so the water would be channeled into locally on site into the ground, and so that it wouldn't run off into a catch basin and out into a stream right away. And with the parking lots, you know, where you're salting them in the wintertime, there's more salt going on there than you need to melt the ice. And if you're using potassium chloride as a substitute, that's fine, but now you're adding potassium, and that's also a fertilizer. So you have to be very careful, and you don't want to starve the aquifer of water that it was already getting. This is part of urban sprawl, because the more that you keep making more rooftops and more parking lots and more roads and fewer trees, you're taking away from what you have left as your water supply. So it's very, you have to be very careful about doing that and make sure that everything is maintained in balance when you do that. Especially, you know, if you start putting up, you think about these solar panels, they're not pervious, they're solid surfaces, they're impervious. So water that falls on them immediately goes onto the ground and runs off quickly. So those are some of the issues around water management and protection of the aquifer where you're building.
Okay, thanks. And for those of you, you know, I just kind of skipped over, you know, any kind of formal introduction of John Thompson, but I just, for anyone who doesn't know John, John is a longtime Medfield resident. He's the president of Waypoint Environmental. He has over 25 years of experience in environmental consulting. He holds an undergraduate degree in geology from the University of Maine, a Master of Science degree in geology from the University of Rhode Island with a concentration in, got cut off, in new, what was concentration in?
And you know, my Master of Science is in glacial hydrogeology.
Okay.
So I studied aquifers you know, just enjoyed being outside and learning about how the natural environment works as a system, but also how it can very quickly go out of balance.
Right. And for those of you that don't know, John is the chairman of the Medfield State Hospital Mediation Committee and the chairman of the Medfield State Hospital Environmental Review Committee. And honestly, if it wasn't for John and Bill Mazzaro, we would have contamination issues up there. It's been decades in terms of trying to just make sure that our Charles River is safe and our town is safe from environmental issues up there. So really the future generations of Medfield are certainly indebted to John for all of his hard work in Medfield.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, you're welcome. So what do I mean, you know, you touched upon some of the things already, John, but are there any burning issues that you want to touch on with regard to, you know, the Elm Street area, the wells in that area, Minebrook? Is there anything that jumps out at you that you think people really should want to know about as they sort of start to evaluate, you know, the impact of a potential building on that site?
Well, I think that's just part of my biggest concern for the town of Medfield is overpopulation. Because most people, when they hear about climate change, you'll never hear a politician talk about overpopulation and connect it to climate change. But it's absolutely the reason for climate change, because more people need more energy and they need more of everything else. And so it's not sustainable. And at a local level, our town needs to watch very carefully the water supply, because it really is the first thing that will limit what we are able to do in the town in terms of our resources.
Hmm.
If we overpopulate, the first thing that we will lose is our water supply. And I know from my own professional experience that going on MWRA water is not a good solution for the town. And maybe other people, don't mind paying the numbers that Andrew was talking about for their water, but once you let someone else have control of your resource, you're also at the control of their rate structure. And so unfortunately, we have to be careful about how we make variances to zoning, for instance, and how many houses and rooftops and parking lots and so forth we will allow in the town. Because as I said, the water supply is a finite number. It's a calculated number. Every person uses between 68 and 72 gallons per day, every single person. So if you multiply that number times the population of the town, you can figure out how many gallons our wells need to deliver to the town. And every time you add another 68 to 72 gallons, you're putting more stress on our water supply. I take the hospital, for instance. If we put 300 units of housing up there, we might add 600 people. Well, now you need to take that number 600 and multiply it times 70. That's how much water our wells will need to provide. And because it's a finite resource, it's not a bottomless pit. Each well has what's called a specific yield. And the specific yield is the number of gallons per day that the well can provide. And a lot of people don't know in the summertime, 95% of the town's water comes out of well number 6 up along the Charles River. And that's because that well is completed right on the bank of the river. So it's literally pulling river water through the sand and gravel and supplying the town. It's very finite resource that you can't ignore.
Right. And I think one of the other questions that Tom Powers had alluded to, the rock salt or the road salt. And I think that there's sort of a two-part question with regard to stormwater management. In talking with two of our different watershed partners, one of the points that they made was that stormwater management, even the most sophisticated stormwater management, isn't 100% foolproof. Is that what's your reaction to that?
That's true, because everybody has put salt in water. It's very water soluble. It dissolves in water readily. So it's very difficult to remove salt. You really can't, because by the time you put it on the snow, it's just going to sit there until the snow melts, and then it's available for spring rain to wash it away into the storm drains. And the best you can do is remove the solids like the sand and gravel, the sand that's put on roads, that binds with some of the salt, and you can catch it in a catch basin, which means you have to have active maintenance of all your catch basins, because all that sand in the bottom of the catch basin is picking up the road salt. So if you don't maintain your infrastructure, then you're setting yourself up to increase the sodium levels in your groundwater supply. And the state is very concerned about the sodium levels because it's connected to hypertension, high blood pressure. So anybody with high blood pressure should not be drinking groundwater from a well that has a high sodium content.
Right. So it seems like a lot of, it seems like in ideal circumstances, you can have bylaws, that prohibit salt use, or you can have bylaws that prohibit, other types of use of chemicals or whatever in certain districts. But who enforces it?
So there really is not much of an enforcement. The Mass Department of Environmental Protection is in an sort of an enforcement role, but more so in the role of providing what they call best management practices. Using alternative chemicals, using chemicals in the right amounts. Right now, the place where our water is tested is at the wastewater treatment plant. And so they probably take samples every month for a suite of chemicals, including sodium chloride, salt, and other chemicals. And Andrew mentioned other things like pharmaceuticals. This pharmaceuticals in all water, and even in water supplies, if I took a sample of the Charles River right now, I could find Motrin in that water. You can find all kinds of pharmaceuticals in the water that's comes from the wastewater plant, and we don't even test for that. That's not even tested.
Great. That's great. There are two questions, and I think what we'll do is after these two questions, we'll move on to Jeff Hyman. Jerry just gave me a heads up on the timing here, just so we can make sure we're sensitive to that. John, a few years ago, this is a question from Vicky Leah. A few years ago, I had 10 inspectors arrive at my house to test our water because the water at Wheelock School came back positive for bacteria. Our concern is, will the additional school affect our water quality? That's her question.
It can, and bacteria can be from other sources. It can be from the buildup of rust and so forth on the inside of old pipes underground. So if the water pipes are very old, and you can get some bacteria that grows in an environment that lacks oxygen, like underground on the inside of a pipe, that bacteria can be floated off and into the water pipe and end up in your faucet, coming out of your faucet. Another way, and some towns fight this, I know Sherborne has had a problem with nitrates from agricultural land with a lot of manure. The nitrates are very water soluble and they can get in water supplies. And another source of bacteria is if you had a lot of Canadian geese on a golf course, for instance, they're eating all those fertilizers and then they're pooping on the golf course, on the grass, and then that's washing into the water. So there's some other sources. And so if you create a lot of big open grassy fields that birds are coming and sitting and eating grass and defecating on the field, and that also goes for anything, dogs and anything else on open space, that some of that will wash into the aquifer. And so they have to be careful about, again, following best management practices and maintenance. And sometimes if the pipes are creating a lot of bacterial problems, you can either add something to kill the bacteria, like hydrogen peroxide or sodium hydroxide, but it can be very difficult to control over time.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question here is from Jeanette Rule, who wanted to know, do you know of any town or city in Massachusetts who does it right with regard to public water supply? If so, can we learn from them?
I think, I've done some work with some volunteer work for the town of Dover, and I think they do a very good job. They work closely with their Board of Health. Town of Dover is completely on groundwater and mostly private groundwater. So they need to be careful that they don't allow too many houses in the town extracting groundwater, because eventually somebody's going to buy a lot and put a water well in, and there's not going to be enough water to support a 4-bedroom house. So you just have to pay attention to it. And most towns that are solely on groundwater put an emphasis on understanding it's a finite resource and that its water quality properties need to be monitored closely.
Okay, thank you. Actually, Gil Rogers came in with another question. How does the cutting down of forests that is occurring all around town with new housing and other developments, for example, Route 27, affect the aquifer and future water supply?
Well, anytime you cut down trees, you reduce the amount of water that's being held back and available for groundwater supplies, because it just simply runs off faster. And there's you have coniferous trees, which are pine trees, and you have deciduous trees, which are leafy trees like Norway maples. And pine trees actually hold more water when it rains. There's more water held up in a pine tree than there is in a maple tree, a tree with a leaf. And that's because of the surface area on a needle. It's like a brush getting wet. When you cut the trees down, that water is no longer dripping off the leaves over time and drying out. It's falling on the ground and it's running away. It's running off. And so you're subtracting more available water that would have naturally saturated the ground and potentially added to the water table.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so I think well, at this point, we'll transition over to our next speaker. John, thank you so much. I know,
Okay, thanks everybody.
I wasn't sure if you're still out of town, but if you are, thank you for carving out the time tonight. It really was great.
Okay,
Thank
thanks
you.
very much.
All right.
Good luck.
We'll
Yep,
talk to you
bye-bye.
later. All right, next up is we have Jeff Hyman here. He's an environmental health and safety professional with more than 35 years of experience supporting biotech and pharmaceutical firms with facilities operations and construction. Jeff manages a diverse team of EHS, occupational health, laboratory operations, and logistics colleagues supporting locations in Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., and Miami, Florida. Jeff has a strong passion for environmental compliance and has built a culture of leadership and sustainable operations, achieving all levels of incredible certifications, gold LEED, platinum LEED from the International Well Building Institute, maintaining zero poison pest control and meeting other stringent standards. He recently received the Wildlife Habitat Council certification for a pollinator-friendly campus in Massachusetts. So Jeff, you're up.
Thank you, Christine. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
And see my screen? Okay. Wow, that was really eye-opening. I have to say, listening to Andrew and John, the passion certainly comes through. I guess I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but I certainly am going to echo a lot of the points that we heard tonight from the other speakers. In my brief presentation, I'll provide perspectives on open space, risks to wells, briefly on net zero aspects, and adaptive reuse of buildings, really in relation to site selection of a new school. So location, location, location. We've all heard this statement. It was actually coined by Harold Samuel, who is a trained land surveyor. And I think for me, the message translates to a number of things, including choosing building sites and complex projects wisely. This requires cross-functional planning with a wide stakeholder base to ensure positive outcomes. I also want to share a couple of my heroes. When I think about protection of the environment and water and open space, these are my heroes. John Muir, and who said, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world. And the interesting thing, that statement was made in the late 1800s. So obviously, John Muir already started to become concerned about the way things were happening. And Ralph Waldo Emerson stated, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." And if you think about that, that makes a lot of sense. Let's learn from the words of these great stewards of the land and make good choices. So why Dale at Dale? And obviously I'm on the coalition. I'm a resident of Medfield of nearly 30 years. As an environmental health and safety professional, it's environment first. And so in my opinion, there are choices, but for me, my talk is really based on why I believe the Dale Street School location is the location for a new school. High level, keep open space. It keeps open space open at Wheelock, does not jeopardize town wells, allows for adaptive reuse of buildings. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail, but at its core, the approach keeps open space open for generations to come. And that's really what's important. Water resources are crucial and imperative. I think we've heard that this evening. It's imperative to our town, and we really need to think about preservation. And building in sensitive areas is a significant risk. So Wheelock open space is a big deal. And I did hear somebody had made a statement, I don't know if it was in the paper in writing or, that what's the big deal? Why can't we just put a school here, build here? What's the big deal? Well, I think it's a big deal. And I'll tell you why. I think when I think about open space and the protection of our streams and watersheds, it's simple. It supports biodiversity, improves air quality and cools the planet, protects vital water sources, provides a human connection with nature, and we don't get enough of that. Although with COVID, ta-da, people have discovered the outdoors, which is pretty amazing. Let's hope people keep thinking that way. Provides mindful recreation and reduces stress by providing a respite from our computer screens, our cell phones, and a number of other light emitting sources. Supports pollinators and food security, provides wildlife habitat. And I think what I heard tonight, Medfield open space, is limited and finite. The water sources within them are limited and finite. And once it's gone for good. You put a building on it, that's it. So we must think both academic needs and nature and educate our children that open space matters and is vital to our existence. Providing a new school at Dale location while preserving open space, in my opinion, accomplishes both. So if you take a look at this map, and I've basically superimposed the proposed school project here at Wheelock. When you look at this map, we notice a multitude of sensitive protection areas. We've talked about it tonight, but this really provides a visual. You see primary aquifer, protection district, well protection district zone 1. You can start to see some boundaries, archaeological protection. And so in the right corner here, you see wellhead. That is one of the wells, and there's another one that's just not shown on the slide. So there are actually two that were mentioned tonight. And the main concern that we all heard and I will resonate with is contaminants and sediment from stormwater runoff that drains from impervious surfaces like roofs, parking lots, and other impervious surfaces. So just to reiterate, and it's been said before, that citizens voted to protect the area, to protect the water. So let's not build here. So if you take a look at these photographs, and Andrew talked about surface water on parking lots. He mentioned gasoline. You can see there's a sheen here headed for the storm drain. This comes from vehicles. And if you look to the left, you see this parking lot. Note, you can see that this parking lot, so you have cars parked, you have stormwater collection infrastructure, so you can see some culvert, a small pond area, some flow. And so stormwater runoff has risks, right? And we heard about that, especially from winter de-icing chemicals, fluid leaks from vehicles. And I work on construction projects within my organization. I've been responsible for regulatory compliance with stormwater pollution prevention. And I can tell you that engineered retention and detention features, they help mitigate, you know, the flow of contaminants. However, it cannot be guaranteed 100%. Nobody can guarantee 100% that that's not going to get breached and head into places where it shouldn't be. And I also want to note that if you look in the pond and a little bit of that water body, nothing is growing in there. It's not vibrant. It doesn't support any kind of aquatic life or plant life. All right, I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to talk about adaptive reuse of buildings. Again, this is a brief presentation. This is slide 8 of 11, high level. But in this example, the photo is a brick structure, a former building, the existing part of the building, and then a newer section where somebody has designed in and combined a space. So adaptive reuse at the Dale site, you know, where you could repurpose certain aspects of the building, add on to it. This blends existing structures with new space. It creates a better experience and with less environmental impact because you have a structure that's already existing and you're going to build onto it. You're not starting from scratch. If you combine this with a net zero approach to energy, right, this tends to be a win-win situation. So specifically, for example, so here's a topographical view of the Dale Street school site. So for example, at the Dale site, designing and building a complex that serves the daily needs of education. So this is an example of adaptive reuse and maybe considering other aspects of the campus nearby. This could serve the daily needs of education as a school, while further serving the needs of recreational programs in the afternoon, weekends, and summertime that would satisfy both needs with one complex that is sustainably designed and fiscally prudent. So you're sort of killing two birds with one stone. You have a school and you have recreation opportunities combining in this, what we call adaptive reuse. So I'm going to shift into net zero because a question, questions have come up, and certainly this is certainly out in the domain and it's certainly debatable. But the question is, can a new building achieve net zero energy status better than an existing building? That's kind of it's an interesting question. What the research and the papers that I read and the professionals that I speak to, the experience is really no, not necessarily, not really. Let's consider the subject in terms of embodied carbon, right? Or the total carbon impact of a building, right? So the existing Dale site already is built. It's already expended its carbon impact over many decades, right? A new building, even with net zero aspects, has a greater total impacts because you're starting from scratch. Especially when we consider all that goes into the manufacture, the mining of the materials, and the manufacture and the transport, and the use of the building materials, such as concrete and steel, as two examples, right? A new building has a significant timeline for that return on investment, and by some estimates, between 30 and 50 years, and I've actually even read recently up to an 80-year return. A new building, this is just sort of a side note, but really important when considering, going green and being green and really thinking about it. It's not necessarily, oh, great, let's build something new, let's make it net zero. Let's also consider that a new building adds additional structure, right? A new building, a large complex to the town, okay? That building must be heated, cooled, cleaned, and maintained, all with additional impact and cost. So adapting, adding, and reusing an existing complex most often costs less.